They told you the attack would come from darkness, but what if it's already sitting on your front door? What if something small, something ignored, has been silently marking your home for spiritual surveillance? An insider has spoken. A former servant of darkness has revealed the code. And what you're about to hear may change how you see your own house forever. You were never supposed to notice it. That's how it works. The system of darkness does not always come with loud manifestations. It prefers silence. It prefers patterns. It prefers symbols hidden in plain sight. The former insider made this clear before any direct spiritual attack is assigned to a home. That home is first identified, marked, observed, catalogued, not randomly, strategically. And one of the most common entry points is not through your windows, not through your prayers, but through something placed right at your front door. Something you may have welcomed, something you may have decorated, something you may have never questioned. Listen carefully, because this is where many believers unknowingly cooperate with what they are praying against. The revelation is this: dark systems look for spiritual alignment, not just spiritual weakness. They don't just attack anyone, they look for signs, indicators, objects that signal agreement, permission, or spiritual openness. And one of those indicators is the presence of certain objects on the front door that carry symbolic meaning beyond your understanding. It could be a decorative item, a charm, a sign, a symbol that seems harmless, but in the spiritual realm, it speaks. You see decoration. They see decoration. You see beauty. They see access. The former insider described it like this: when agents of darkness move through regions, they don't rely on guesswork. They look for markers. And these markers help them determine which homes are safe to engage, which homes are open to influence, which homes have unknowingly stepped into alignment with systems they do not understand. And one of the strongest markers is anything that represents protection outside of God. Pause and think. What have you placed on your door, believing it brings safety? What symbol have you trusted? What object have you allowed to stand as a guard? Because here is the truth that shakes many. Anything you trust spiritually becomes a gateway spiritually. If it is not rooted in truth, it becomes an invitation. The insider revealed that homes displaying certain symbolic protections, whether cultural, traditional, or aesthetic, are often flagged as spiritually accessible. Why? Because it shows a shift in reliance. It shows that the occupants may not be fully anchored, and in spiritual warfare, divided trust is dangerous. Now understand this clearly. This is not about fear. This is about awareness. Because many believers have opened doors, not through rebellion, but through ignorance. And ignorance is one of the most powerful tools darkness uses. You hang something on your door because it looks good, because it's trending, because someone gifted it to you, because it feels meaningful. But you never asked, what does this represent beyond what I see? What agreement does this create beyond what I intend? Because spiritual laws do not operate based on your intention alone. They operate on alignment, on symbols, on authority. The insider made something else very clear. Before any serious oppression, harassment, or delay begins in a household, there is often a period of observation. And during that time, these markers matter. They act like signals. They help determine whether resistance will be strong or whether entry will be easy. And many times, the very object placed for peace becomes a silent announcement of vulnerability. You must understand this. Because once a home is marked as accessible, the activity may not be immediate. It can be gradual, subtle, unnoticeable at first. Small disturbances, unusual patterns, delays, confusion, tension that has no clear source. And you begin to fight symptoms without ever addressing the entry points. This is how cycles begin, quietly, legally in the spiritual sense, because something was allowed, something was given a place, something was trusted, and that trust created access. The former insider warned that many homes never realized they were marked. They only realize something is wrong when the effects begin to manifest. But by then, the system has already recognized the house, already categorized it, already initiated subtle operations, and the most painful part, the occupants are praying, fasting, declaring, but still experiencing resistance. Why? Because there is something at the door that speaks louder than their words, something that contradicts their authority, something that creates confusion in the spiritual realm. This is why awareness matters. Because you cannot fight what you refuse to identify. You cannot close a door you don't know if it's open. And you cannot remove a marker if you don't even see it as a marker. So right now, You must examine your space, not with fear, but with authority. Look at your door. Look at what you have allowed to represent your home. Ask yourself, does this reflect truth, or does it carry meaning I never questioned? Because in spiritual warfare, nothing is neutral. Everything speaks, everything signals, everything aligns with something. And the moment you understand this, you begin to take back control. You begin to remove silent agreements. You begin to shut down access points. You begin to reclaim territory. Because your home was never meant to be marked by darkness. It was meant to be covered, protected, sealed, not by objects, but by authority. And that authority starts with awareness. The marking is only the beginning. What happens after is where many lose the battle without even realizing it has started. Because once a home is identified as accessible, the next phase is not immediate attack. It is silent, observation, calculated, patient, intentional. The former insider revealed that darkness studies patterns before it strikes. It watches behavior. It tracks consistency. It measures spiritual resistance. You may think nothing is happening, but something is watching. Not physically, spiritually. And this observation phase is where most believers become vulnerable. Why? Because they relax. They assume everything is fine. They continue routines without discernment. They ignore small disruptions. And those small disruptions are not random. They are probes, tests, signals to measure how alert or unaware you really are. It can start subtly. You begin to feel unusual heaviness in your home. Not constant, just moments. Moments you brush off. Then comes tension. Arguments that don't make sense. Misunderstandings that escalate too quickly. Silence that feels unnatural. And you think it's emotional. You think it's stress. But behind the scenes, your environment is being tested. The insider explained that during this phase, they are not looking to destroy immediately. They are looking to gain ground slowly, because gradual infiltration is harder to detect, more effective, more sustainable. And one of the primary strategies used is to create spiritual distraction, to pull your focus away from what matters, to reduce your awareness, to weaken your consistency. You start skipping what once kept you grounded. You delay what once gave you strength. You lose urgency. And without realizing it, your spiritual defense begins to thin out. Not because you chose darkness, but because you lost sharpness. This is how access deepens. Not through one big moment, but through many small compromises, moments of inattention, moments of delay, moments of spiritual fatigue. The insider emphasized something critical. Once a home passes the observation phase without resistance, it is flagged as low alert territory. And that is when activity increases, because now there is confidence that the occupants are not fully aware, confidence that entry points will not be challenged, confidence that operations can proceed quietly. And this is where patterns begin to intensify. You notice delays in areas that used to flow, opportunities stall, plans collapse without explanation. You experience cycles, the same issue repeating in different forms, and no matter what you do, it feels like something is resisting your progress. But the root is deeper than the surface. Because this is no longer just observation. This is influence, subtle at first, then consistent. The atmosphere of your home begins to shift. Peace becomes unstable. Clarity becomes rare. Rest becomes difficult. And the most dangerous part? You begin to normalize it. You adapt to it. You accept it as part of life. And that is exactly what the system wants. Because once you normalize dysfunction, you stop fighting it. You stop questioning it. You stop resisting it. And what you tolerate gains strength. The insider revealed that many households remain in this phase for years, not because they lack power, but because they lack awareness. They are fighting battles externally, while the entry point remains active internally, and everything traces back to what was allowed, to what was ignored, to what was never questioned. Now hear this clearly. Your home was never designed to be a place of silent struggle. It was designed to be a place of authority. But authority requires intentional presence. It requires awareness. It requires consistency. Because in spiritual warfare, neglect creates openings, and openings invite influence. This is why you must not ignore patterns. You must not dismiss repeated disruptions. You must not accept cycles that drain your peace. Because patterns are not accidents. They are indicators, signals that something deeper is at work. And the moment you begin to recognize those signals, you shift from being passive to being intentional. You begin to question what you once ignored. You begin to challenge what you once tolerated. You begin to restore what was weakened. And this is where the shift begins. Because the system of darkness depends on your silence. It depends on your distraction. It depends on your lack of awareness. But the moment you become alert, everything changes. Because observation can no longer remain hidden. Influence can no longer remain subtle. Access can no longer remain unchallenged. And this is why this revelation matters. Because you are not dealing with random events. You are dealing with a process, a system, a strategy. You stop reacting emotionally and you start responding intentionally. You begin to take back control of your space. You begin to re-establish boundaries. You begin to restore order. Because your home is not a testing ground. It is territory. And territory must be guarded. Not occasionally, but consistently. So now the question becomes, will you continue to ignore the signs, or will you rise in awareness and shut down what has been silently operating? Because what you do next determines what continues or what ends. Now you understand the marking, you understand the observation, but this is where it becomes dangerous. Because once influence begins to take hold, the system shifts from watching your home to working inside your home. This is the phase many never recognize. Because nothing looks obviously wrong. There is no dramatic event, no visible sign, just a slow, calculated shift in atmosphere. The former insider described it as internal weakening, not by force, but by infiltration. You see, once access is gained, the goal is no longer just entry. The goal becomes control through environment. And the first thing targeted is your spiritual sensitivity. You stop noticing what you used to notice. You stop feeling what you used to feel. Conviction becomes quieter. Discernment becomes dull. What once disturbed you no longer affects you the same way. And that is not growth. That is desensitization. Because when sensitivity drops, resistance drops, and when resistance drops, influence expands. The insider made this painfully clear. Dark systems do not always overpower believers. They wear them down, slowly, strategically, until what was once strong becomes inconsistent, and what was once clear becomes confusing. This is where mental patterns begin to shift. You begin to overthink, second guess, doubt decisions you once made with confidence. You feel stuck between choices, paralyzed by uncertainty, and you think it's pressure, you think it's life. But behind the scenes, there is a subtle interference with your clarity. Because confusion is not random, it is a tool, a weapon designed to keep you unstable. Because a confused mind cannot operate in authority, and authority is what threatens the system, so it must be weakened, quietly, internally. Then comes emotional instability. You react stronger than necessary, you feel heavier than usual, you carry weight you cannot explain, and the smallest things begin to trigger deeper responses. This is not coincidence, this is pressure being applied to destabilize your internal state. Because when your emotions are unstable, your decisions become unstable. And when your decisions are unstable, your direction becomes unclear. And once your direction is unclear, you begin to drift away from discipline, away from structure, away from what once grounded you. The insider revealed that this phase is critical because this is where many unknowingly partner with the pressure. They start agreeing with the thoughts, agreeing with the confusion, agreeing with the emotional weight. An agreement is powerful because what you agree with, you give permission to remain. This is how cycles lock in. Not just through external access, but through internal agreement. You start saying things like, I don't feel the same anymore, I can't focus like before, everything feels off. And those statements begin to reinforce the very condition you are trying to escape. Because words carry alignment, they reinforce direction, they solidify patterns, and the system feeds on that. Because now it is no longer just influencing your environment, it is influencing your language, your mindset, your perception. And once perception is altered, reality begins to feel different. Even if nothing physically changed, this is the depth of the strategy. It moves from external markers to internal control. And the most dangerous part? You still believe you are in full control, but your patterns say otherwise. Your reactions say otherwise. Your consistency says otherwise. This is why many remain stuck, because they are fighting externally, while internally they have already been compromised. The insider warned, if this phase continues unchecked, it leads to spiritual fatigue. A state where you know what to do, but you don't do it. You feel the need to act, but you delay. You recognize the issue, but you lack the urgency to confront it. And this is not laziness. This is exhaustion, engineered exhaustion. Because once you are tired, you stop resisting. And once you stop resisting, the system stabilizes its control. Now everything becomes routine. The heaviness becomes normal. The confusion becomes expected. The inconsistency becomes accepted. And what was once a temporary phase becomes a lifestyle. This is how territories are lost. Not in one moment, but in many unnoticed shifts, small compromises, quiet agreements, gradual weakening, until the environment feels completely different, but you can't trace when it changed. This is why awareness alone is not enough. There must be interruption, a deliberate decision to break the pattern, to reject the agreement, to challenge the condition, because what continues is what is allowed, and what is allowed becomes established. So now you must ask yourself, what have I normalized that was never meant to stay? What have I agreed to with that I should have resisted? What patterns have I accepted that are draining my authority? Because the moment you identify those things, you create an opportunity for reversal. You disrupt the system. You break the cycle. You begin to reclaim control from the inside out. And once internal control is restored, external influence begins to collapse. Because the system cannot thrive where there is awareness and resistance and alignments. This is the turning point. Not when you notice something is wrong, but when you decide it will not continue. This is where everything shifts, not in what you feel, but in what you decide. Because once you recognize the pattern, once you see the entry, once you understand the strategy, you are no longer a target, you become a threat. The former insider made this clear. Dark systems rely on unquestioned access. They depend on silence. They depend on agreement. They depend on your lack of response. But the moment you become intentional, you disrupt everything. This is the phase of removal and reclamation. And it begins with one simple but powerful act. You remove the marker. That object on your door, that symbol you never questioned, it must go. Not because it looks dangerous, but because of what it represents. Because in spiritual warfare, representation carries authority, and anything that speaks a language outside of truth must not remain at your entrance. Your door is not decoration, it is a boundary. It is a line between territory and access. And what sits on that boundary matters, so you remove it without hesitation, without attachment, without explanation. Because you are not dealing with sentiment, you are dealing with alignment. Then comes the second step, you reclaim the atmosphere of your home. Because removal creates space, but space must be filled intentionally. You cannot leave a vacuum. The insider warned that many remove access but fail to establish authority, and that leaves room for re-entry. Must become active, consistent, deliberate. You set order. You restore discipline. You bring structure back into your environment, not occasionally, but daily. Because authority is not a one-time action. It is a maintained position. Then comes the third step. You break internal agreements. Every thought, every pattern, every statement that aligned with confusion, with heaviness, with instability, you confront it. You reject it. You refuse to let it define your reality. Because what you no longer agree with loses its power over you. This is where many hesitate. Because breaking agreement requires confrontation. It requires awareness. It requires consistency. But this is where control is taken back, from the inside out. Then comes the fourth step. You establish clear boundaries. Not just physically, but spiritually, mentally, emotionally. You decide what is allowed, what is not allowed, what stays, what leaves. Because without boundaries, access returns, quietly, gradually, again. But boundaries enforced with awareness create resistance, and resistance disrupts systems. Now understand this. This is not about fear. This is about authority. Because fear reacts, authority responds. Fear panics, authority acts. And you are never meant to live in reaction. You are meant to operate in control. The insider reveals something powerful. The moment a home shifts from passive to intentional, everything changes. Because the system no longer finds agreement. It no longer finds silence. It no longer finds ease of access. And without those elements, it cannot operate effectively. This is why some homes experience sudden shifts. Peace returns, clarity increases, stability is restored. Not because something new was added, but because something unauthorized was removed, and authority was re-established. This is the power of alignment. This is the power of awareness. This is the power of intentional action. So now the responsibility is yours, not to fear what was revealed, but to act on it, to examine your space, to remove what does not belong, to restore what was weakened, to protect what has been entrusted to you. Because your home is not random space, it is territory. And territory must be governed with awareness, with discipline, with authority. Because once you take responsibility, the system loses its hold. Once you become consistent, access is denied. Once you stand in authority, everything that relied on your silence begins to collapse. This is the final shift, from being observed to being untouchable, from being influenced to being in control, from being unaware to being fully awake. And once you reach this point, there is no going back. Now you see it. Now you understand what was hidden in plain sight. Your home was never meant to be mocked. It was meant to stand in authority. What you remove will break cycles. What you enforce will restore order. Rise now. Take control and let every unauthorized presence collapse.